July 20th, 1944. 12:42 p.m. Inside a wooden conference barrack at the Wolf's Lair, a briefcase bomb detonates, meant to kill Adolf Hitler. Of all the plots against him, none would come closer to success than this. Within minutes of the blast, specific decisions and physical details would decide the outcome. These are the final 24 hours of Operation Valkyrie, the plot to take out Hitler. The turning point had roots years earlier. A covert opposition began to form inside the regime itself. As early as 1938, officers around Hans Oster and Ludwig Beck reached out to sympathetic civilians, laying down contacts that later conspirators would rely on. By 1941 to 1942, the center of gravity shifted to the Eastern Front and Berlin offices, where a tighter military network accepted a stark conclusion: Hitler would destroy Germany unless he was stopped. Their disillusionment ran deeper than failed campaigns. It was moral. Reports from the East described mass shootings by Einsatzgruppen and the systematic murder of Jews. Officers saw columns of deportees, heard field complaints about executions, and read memoranda that reduced human lives to logistics. Duty collided with conscience. The oath hung heavier with each dispatch. Major General Henning von Tresckow and General Friedrich Olbricht became the plot's principal architects. Tresckow, driven by ethical conviction and hardened by earlier failed attempts, pursued assassination as a necessary first step. Olbricht focused on the machinery that would have to move the second the first blow landed. Killing Hitler was not enough. The state would have to be seized before the SS and party loyalists could regroup. The tool was already on the books. Operation Valkyrie was designed to mobilize the replacement army in case of internal unrest, including potential uprisings by the millions of foreign forced laborers inside the Reich. Its official purpose sounded like routine: restore order, guard infrastructure, secure communications. To the conspirators, that routine was the camouflage. From his position in the General Army Office, Olbricht began a clandestine revision of the Valkyrie orders. He twisted its logic line by line. The opening declaration was reworded to trigger immediate action. The Führer, Adolf Hitler, is dead. A treacherous group of party leaders has attempted to exploit the situation. From that premise, the internal enemy shifted. No longer a hypothetical mass of foreign workers, it became the Nazi Party's own power centers, the SS and Gestapo. The revised orders authorized army units to occupy government buildings and radio stations, secure telephone exchanges, and arrest senior SS and party officials. The language remained bureaucratic. The intent did not. A defensive protocol had been converted into a blueprint for a coup d'etat. This network reached beyond a handful of officers. It touched military district commands, the Abwehr, and selected civilian figures who could staff a provisional cabinet. Karl Goerdeler, the former mayor of Leipzig and a conservative statesman, stood ready as the designated chancellor. Others in Berlin's police and ministries quietly aligned resources. A shadow government waited for a single condition. Verification was the fuse. Only proof of Hitler's death could activate Valkyrie without exposing the plot. That required proximity, access, and an ability to move inside the Wolf's Lair without arousing suspicion. The conspirators needed a courier and a killer in one uniform, someone whose rank opened doors and whose resolve would not break under the weight of the oath he had sworn. The reluctant assassin was Claus von Stauffenberg. He was an improbable candidate. From an aristocratic family steeped in military service, he rose as a talented staff officer who believed national revival required hard decisions. In 1939, he supported the invasion of Poland, seeing it as a step toward restoring Germany's strength and prestige. His records seem to confirm his trajectory. Decorated in the field, his service with the Afrika Korps embedded him among the Wehrmacht's elite. By all outward appearances, he was a loyal officer advancing within the system. The break began under fire. In Tunisia, in 1943, Allied aircraft strafed his staff car. He lost his left eye, his entire right hand, and 2 fingers on his left. The physical toll was immense. Convalescence removed him from the front and forced a pause. Away from operations, he confronted reports that catalogued crimes rather than victories. His Catholic faith sharpened the conflict. Evidence from the Eastern Front, Einsatzgruppen, shootings, deportations, the planned extermination of Jews, made obedience feel like complicity. By 1942 to 1943, his opposition had hardened. The war no longer appeared as national defense. It was now a moral catastrophe. He concluded that continued loyalty to Hitler would destroy Germany in body and in soul. Assassination, once unthinkable, became a duty. Opportunity followed conviction. In August 1943, after recovery, he was appointed Chief of Staff to General Friedrich Fromm, commander of the replacement army. The role granted more than rank. It opened doors to Hitler's military conferences at the Wolf's Lair and at Berchtesgaden, placing Stauffenberg within the tight circle where proximity could be weaponized. In Berlin, his desk sat at the nerve center that controlled mobilization orders. From that desk, he could shepherd the revisions to Valkyrie. He could ensure the wording aligned with the moment they were engineering and, when the signal came, trigger the mechanism without hesitation. Access and authority converged in one officer. His wounds became an emblem and a discipline. He relearned basic tasks, trained his remaining fingers to manipulate a pen and, critically, the pliers required to crush a detonator capsule. The physical constraints slowed him, but they also narrowed his focus. He moved with purpose, masking intent beneath procedure. The man who had sworn a personal oath to Hitler now prepared to break it in the only way he believed could save the country. He accepted that the path would likely end in death. What mattered was that the effort be exact, timed, and credible to those who would have to act on it. Around him, a bureaucratic instrument waited to be set in motion. On paper, it looked routine and loyal. In practice, it would redefine the enemy and give the army a script to seize control the instant a death was confirmed. The next step was to align that script with a single point of impact. Operation Valkyrie represented a sophisticated act of bureaucratic deception. On its official face, the plan appeared entirely loyalist. Its stated purpose was to provide the German High Command with a tool to maintain internal security. The scenario it anticipated was a massive breakdown of order, potentially triggered by an uprising among the approximately 7.5 million foreign forced laborers inside the Reich by 1944. In such a crisis, the replacement army would mobilize to secure key government buildings, communication centers, and transport hubs in Berlin and other major cities. It was a contingency plan, filed away and largely forgotten. Friedrich Olbricht's revisions systematically subverted this logic. He twisted the plan's internal targeting mechanism. The documents were altered to redefine the internal enemy. This enemy was no longer a hypothetical foreign uprising. The new target became the Nazi party apparatus itself, specifically the SS and the Gestapo. The revised Valkyrie orders authorized army units to seize control of the state by arresting senior SS leaders and occupying their headquarters, all while claiming the army was maintaining law and order. The language was legitimate. The intention was not. A defensive measure became an offensive weapon for a coup d'état, hiding a revolution inside a routine emergency protocol. The entire mechanism, however, possessed a critical and inflexible precondition. Both the original and revised orders stipulated that the replacement army could only be mobilized upon definitive confirmation of Adolf Hitler's death. This was more than a practical safeguard. It was a legal boundary. Under normal conditions, only Hitler or General Fromm could order the replacement army to act. A verified announcement of Hitler's death would create the legal and hierarchical pretext to move without him and to pressure from or circumvent him with apparent legitimacy. Without verified proof, the orders lacked authority. Staff officers across Germany, trained to follow chains of command, would likely dismiss the commands as a trick or a mutiny if they suspected Hitler was still alive. This requirement dictated a plan of flawless, near-simultaneous timing. The announcement of Hitler's death and the transmission of Valkyrie orders to military districts had to occur almost as one event. Any delay between the explosion and activation of the coup machinery would create a fatal vacuum. In that window, regime loyalists like Joseph Goebbels and Heinrich Himmler could contact local commands, create doubt, and mobilize a counter-response. The SS, with its own independent structure, would move quickly to crush a putsch. The plan was a clockwork mechanism. The assassination was the mainspring. The interlocking gears were phone calls, radio bulletins, and, crucially, the military teleprinter network that could push orders across Germany within minutes. A delay of even an hour could be catastrophic. Any ambiguity about Hitler's fate would cause the apparatus to seize. The conspirators knew their masterpiece depended on absolute certainty, and on a moment when that certainty could be claimed without challenge. By mid-1944, that window was narrowing fast. Against that tightening backdrop, the conspirators crossed into the point of no return. The Allied landings in Normandy on June 6th opened a decisive second front. In the east, the Soviet summer offensive, Operation Bagration, was annihilating Army Group Center. The military situation deteriorated with a speed that shocked even the most pessimistic planners. Each day of delay hardened Germany's fate. They also felt the net closing at home. By summer 1944, the Gestapo was moving closer to dissident circles, interrogating contacts and tracing lines through the Abwehr. Time pressure came from the front and from within. Their earlier failures weighed heavily. Since 1941, key figures like Henning von Tresckow had searched for opportunities, only to watch chance collapse into routine. On March 13, 1943, Tresckow placed British plastic explosives disguised as bottles of Cointreau aboard Hitler's plane. The detonator was triggered, but the charge failed to explode in the cold cargo hold. 8 days later, on March 21st, 1943, Heroes Memorial Day, another plan prepared a suicide attack during a uniform inspection. The event was cancelled. Further attempts followed in November 1943, February 1944, and March 1944. The Führer's erratic schedule and what many called his uncanny luck repeatedly thwarted them. Each failure increased the risk of discovery and drained morale. Stauffenberg's appointment as Chief of Staff to the replacement army commander created a new, fleeting chance. His role required attendance at Hitler's military situation conferences, providing the close access that had eluded the network. A specific date emerged: July 20th, 1944. He would travel to the Wolf's Lair to deliver a report on forming new infantry divisions. It was routine on paper, and therefore ideal. The conspirators judged that waiting meant surrendering the possibility of a coup. The war moved too fast. The Gestapo moved faster. The decision to proceed was a calculated gamble, driven by desperation and conviction. Their motivations were layered. Some, like Karl Goerdeler, hoped to salvage something for Germany's moral standing and preserve national institutions from total collapse. Others, including Stauffenberg, saw assassination as patriotic duty, a moral imperative to halt crimes and prevent further bloodshed. There was also strategic nuance. Several conspirators believed a separate peace with the Western Allies might be possible while continuing resistance against the Soviet Union. It was a flawed hope, but it shaped their planning and their sense of urgency. The machinery of the coup stood ready. The revised Valkyrie orders had been finalized and placed in the hands of key commands. A shadow cabinet waited to step in with legitimacy the instant the signal arrived. Everything hinged on a single act at a remote headquarters in East Prussia. They had committed. No more delay, no more contingency. What remained was the method and the place where proximity could be turned into a weapon. The Wolf's Lair was the stage. Built on paranoia, the headquarters sat deep in the Masurian forests of East Prussia. It was Hitler's primary command post for the Eastern Front, a sprawling complex of more than 80 buildings, many of them heavily fortified concrete bunkers with walls up to 8 meters thick, all camouflaged within dense woodland. Security was layered. The site was divided into 3 concentric zones, Sperrkreis, 3, 2, and 1, each with its own checkpoints, patrols, and fences. The innermost Sperrkreis 1, where Hitler lived and held briefings, admitted only holders of special passes. SS bodyguards from the Führerbegleitkommando were constant, and identity checks were applied to every visitor regardless of rank. Bringing a conventional firearm or grenade into the inner compound was a logistical impossibility. This environment dictated the weapon. The conspirators chose captured British plastic explosive, issued as compact clams, roughly the size of a small pocketbook, because it was stable, moldable, and had little telltale odor. 2 charges, about 1 kilogram each, promised a lethal blast in a confined space. Molded into a standard officer's briefcase, the explosive became part of the scenery. Maps, folders, and a case among many. The fuse was equally discreet. They used a British time pencil, a chemical delay igniter containing cupric chloride that would corrode a thin wire restraining a firing pin. When the wire parted, the spring drove the pin into a detonator. The design delivered about a 10-minute delay. Activation required crushing the capsule to release the reagent. For Stauffenberg, who had lost his right hand and 2 fingers on his left, it was a test of precision and pain. He practiced with special pliers adapted to allow him to pinch the capsule and start the clock. The method relied on routine. As a senior staff officer, Stauffenberg could carry a briefcase into the conference without scrutiny. His duties required documents and maps, making the case a natural accessory. Once in the room, he would place it under the table as close to Hitler as possible, start the time pencil, and withdraw on a pretext, a phone call, a report to be signed, using his rank to pass back through the layers of security before the delay expired. The simplicity was the shield. The components were inert until armed. No conventional weapon crossed the thresholds. The blind spot was institutional, the assumption that a high-ranking officer would not use access as a weapon. Stauffenberg's uniform and authority opened the doors. The real risk collected in the last meters between the threshold and the table. Inside the Wolf's Lair, variables still existed beyond human control. The setting of the daily conference would shape how a blast traveled through space, how pressure moved, and how a briefcase could be placed without drawing attention. The day would impose its own conditions. On the morning of July 20th, a last-minute change cut across the plan's assumptions. The venue shifted. The daily situation conference had been scheduled, as usual, for the underground concrete bunker. That was standard procedure. It offered maximum protection against air attack and assassination, and it fit the conspirators' calculations. But Hitler disliked the airless confinement, and on this hot day, he ordered the meeting moved to the above-ground situation barracks, the Lagerbaracke, inside the innermost compound, Sperrkreis 1. 2 officers filing in, it looked like a small accommodation for comfort within the same guarded zone. The perimeter had not changed. The room had. The difference in construction mattered. The original plan assumed a blast inside a reinforced, tight space. In a concrete bunker, pressure from an explosion cannot easily escape. It rebounds off the walls and ceiling, intensifying the shock wave and turning the room into a lethal pressure chamber. In that environment, a charge placed close to the target would be magnified by the confinement. The Lagerbaracke was a wooden structure with large windows. It was not built to contain a blast. When an explosive detonates in such a room, much of the pressure vents outward. Windows blow, panels flex, roofs lift. The shock wave disperses instead of ricocheting back through the occupants. The same device that would have been devastating in the bunker would lose killing power in a vented space. This was not a minor adjustment. The conspirators had calibrated the explosive to the bunker scenario. They expected containment. They expected overpressure. The switch to the wooden conference room removed those assumptions and introduced variables that favored survival. Open windows, weaker walls, a roof that could give way. A decision made minutes before the meeting altered the physics of the attempt. The change interacted with other conditions that still had to align for success. Proximity to the target, the exact placement of the briefcase, the number of people in the room, and the timing of Stauffenberg's exit remained decisive. Even with the venue working against them, the plot could still succeed if the device sat close enough and the delay matched the moment. That is why the location shift, while critical, became one factor among several that would decide whether the assassination reached its mark. To the men inside Sperrkreis 1, it was a routine relocation. To the conspirators, if they had known in time, it would have signaled a dangerous reduction in odds. Yet the schedule held. The conference would proceed in the Lagerbaracke. Security procedures would remain in force. Access would be granted to those whose roles required it. Claus von Stauffenberg and his aide were already en route. The next moves would depend on minutes. The 13-minute window opened with logistics, not drama. Claus von Stauffenberg reached the Wolf's Lair with his aide, Werner von Heften, shortly before the conference. They carried 2 1-kilogram packets of British plastic explosive, the time pencils, and the briefcase that would carry them into the room. They were shown to a private space in Field Marshal Keitel's office area, where preparation could pass as routine staff work. The arming process demanded precision under pressure. Using specially modified pliers, Stauffenberg, working with his remaining fingers, crushed the copper capsule inside a British time pencil. The chemical released would corrode a restraining wire until a spring drove a firing pin into the detonator. The delay provided only a narrow margin. Then, time compressed. While he and von Heften began to prepare the second charge, a summons arrived to hurry to the briefing. Under that pressure, Stauffenberg placed only 1 prepared explosive packet into the briefcase and left the other with von Heften. The reduction was circumstantial, not strategic. He had intended to use both. He entered the wooden conference barracks, the Lagerbaracke. The meeting was already underway. Around 24 officers clustered along a massive oak table spread with maps of the Eastern Front. Hitler stood on one side, focused on unit dispositions and losses. Stauffenberg took a position to Hitler's right, several places down. Close, but not ideal. He slid the briefcase beneath the table and set it hard against the heavy oak support leg nearest to Hitler. That detail mattered. Explosives do not travel evenly through obstacles. A dense barrier can deflect and absorb the force. Placement against the leg gave concealment and stability, but it also introduced a potential shield between the charge and the target. He lingered just long enough to normalize his presence. The pre-arranged call came to the barracks. An adjutant stepped in, requesting Stauffenberg for an urgent telephone message from Berlin concerning the divisions he was to discuss. He stepped out, calm and deliberate, leaving the briefcase where it sat. Outside, von Heften rejoined him. They moved with practiced composure through the inner security zone. The device was armed. The delay was running. They needed distance before the blast and a line to Berlin to set Valkyrie in motion if confirmation came. The urgency was real, but it was measured in actions, exits, gates, vehicles, not in exact minutes. Inside the Lagerbaracke, the discussion continued over maps and casualty figures. The briefcase remained under the table, pressed against the oak support, unnoticed among boots and chair legs. The next moments would belong to small movements inside that room, while the Count continued in silence. Inside the wooden conference barracks, the meeting stayed fixed on the Eastern Front. Colonel Heinz Brandt, standing near Hitler, leaned in for a clearer view of the overlays spread across the massive oak table. Stauffenberg's briefcase sat in his line of sight, wedged against the thick table support. Brandt bent down, lifted the case, and slid it beyond the same heavy leg to the far side. It took seconds. It carried no suspicion. He removed what looked like a trivial obstruction. That ordinary motion became decisive. The briefcase ended up farther from Hitler. More importantly, the thick wooden support now stood directly between the charge and the target. The oak leg absorbed and deflected the blast that would shortly erupt, pushing the force away from Hitler's position. The distance changed by only a few feet. The effect changed by orders of survival. The countdown did not care. The time pencil inside the case continued to eat through its wire. Nothing about the move altered chemistry or sequence. Around the table, voices returned to unit strengths and withdrawals. No one registered the relocated case beneath their knees. Outside the barracks, Stauffenberg and Werner von Haeften moved to exit the inner zone, convinced the placement had been lethal and that the first condition for Valkyrie had been met. They were calm and methodical, aiming to clear the compound and reach a line to Berlin. In their minds, the operation had shifted from assassination to activation. Inside, the geometry of survival had been set. The wooden room vented pressure. The oak leg stood as a barrier. The man who shifted the briefcase, Brandt, unknowingly placed himself in the path of the blast he redirected. He would not survive the day. The irony is stark. The action that spared Hitler's life cost Brandt his own. Stauffenberg had come close. His initial placement put the charge within a lethal radius, especially if confinement had matched the original bunker plan. Two factors undermined it: the move to the Lagerbaracke and the briefcase's shift behind the table leg. Both were mundane. Both were final. The plot's brilliance could not outrun those inches of wood. The key variables, proximity, shielding, and the room's construction, now pointed away from a kill. The mechanism would still perform with devastating force. It would not deliver the one result the conspirators required. In the next instant, the timer reached its end. The room awaited the outcome that would decide everything that followed. 12:42 p.m. marked the detonation. The chemical timer completed its circuit, and the explosion tore through the wooden barracks with immense force. Approximately 24 men were in the room. The blast shattered the large windows and lifted the roof structure. Smoke, splinters, and debris filled the air. The interior became a crucible of chaos. The massive oak conference table splintered. Chairs slammed against walls. 4 men would not survive their wounds. Stenographer Heinrich Berger, taking notes at his post, was killed instantly. Colonel Heinz Brandt, the officer who had moved the briefcase, suffered grievous injuries and died later. General Rudolf Schmundt, Hitler's chief adjutant, succumbed the following day. General Günther Kortin, chief of the Luftwaffe General Staff, also died from his wounds. The force was lethal at close range, but its distribution was uneven. Every other person in the room sustained significant injuries. Shards from the wooden table and bomb casing caused deep lacerations. Concussions from the pressure wave left many dazed and disoriented. Several officers suffered burns from the explosive flash. The physical toll was immediate and widespread. Adolf Hitler was hurled back by the blast. His trousers were singed and tattered. He suffered burns, bruises, temporary paralysis in his right arm, perforated eardrums, and conjunctivitis in his right eye. Yet he lived. 2 elements had intervened. The thick oak table leg acted as a shield, absorbing and deflecting much of the force away from his position, and the wooden construction of the Lagerbaracke vented pressure out through windows in the compromised roof instead of trapping it as a concrete bunker would have done. Confusion followed. Dust, smoke, and the shock of impact produced fractured impressions and conflicting statements. For minutes, it was unclear who had survived. Some on site believed no one could have lived through the blast. That ambiguity mattered. General Erich Feldgiebel, the communications chief at the Wolf's Lair and a member of the conspiracy, moved to sever external lines. He disrupted several circuits and interfered with traffic, but he could not completely isolate the headquarters. Messages bled through in both directions, urgent, partial, and often contradictory. The machinery was not fully cut. It stuttered. This partial blackout created an information vacuum that the conspirators needed, but it also seeded doubt. Berlin required a verified report before triggering Valkyrie. The first and most critical precondition, proof of Hitler's death, had failed at the source, but confirmation of survival had not yet cohered into a single authoritative message. Fragmented reports began to cross with orders already drafted for activation. In East Prussia, smoke still drifted above the shattered barracks. At the same moment, men far from the blast line weighed what they thought they knew against what they needed to do next. The race to Berlin began the moment Stauffenberg cleared the inner gates and committed to activation. From a distance, Claus von Stauffenberg and Werner von Haeften saw the explosion. A violent blast of smoke and debris erupted from the wooden barracks. Convinced that the detonation was lethal and that no one could have survived, they moved with determined speed into the next phase of their plan. Their immediate objective was to escape the Wolf's Lair complex before security was fully locked down. They bluffed their way through the 3 concentric security checkpoints, maintaining a calm demeanor that belied the urgency of their situation. Their uniforms and ranks provided the necessary authority to pass without intensive questioning. On the drive to the airfield, they disposed of the unused charge. The second bomb, still unarmed, was thrown into the woods to avoid discovery during any search. Then they reached the waiting Heinkel, He-111. Wheels up came shortly after 1:15 p.m. Ground delays in the flight itself would put them back over Berlin near 4 p.m. The interval created a critical and unavoidable gap between the blast and the Coups' activation. During this window, the conspirators stationed at the Bendlerblock, the German army headquarters in Berlin, entered a state of suspended animation. General Friedrich Olbricht and his colleagues were poised to activate Operation Valkyrie, but they operated under a strict protocol. They required definitive confirmation from Stauffenberg himself before they could issue the orders that would mobilize the replacement army. The entire plan was designed to activate only upon verified proof of Hitler's death. Without that confirmation, initiating the coup was an enormous and potentially suicidal risk. They waited, the machinery of their rebellion frozen, for the signal to begin. A key conspirator at the Wolf's Lair had a specific critical role in this interim period. General Erich Feldgiebel, the chief of signals at Hitler's headquarters, was tasked with isolating the complex. His objective was to sever or disrupt external communications, preventing the truth about Hitler's survival from reaching Berlin and other military commands before the Valkyrie orders could take effect. Feldgiebel managed to temporarily disrupt some telephone and teleprinter lines, creating initial confusion. However, he could not completely seal off the headquarters. The network was too vast and redundant. Loyal officers quickly began restoring links. Feldgiebel then faced a hard choice. He knew Hitler had survived, yet sending a clear message risked interception and immediate exposure. He transmitted a cryptic line to his deputy in Berlin, General Fritz Thieler. "Something terrible has happened. The Führer is alive." The wording was ambiguous. It could imply survival with mortal injuries or temporary uncertainty. In the Bendlerblock, Thieler and Olbricht read the same words and drew the same cautious conclusion. Wait for Stauffenberg's personal confirmation. Precious minutes turned to hours while the Heinkel crossed Germany. In Berlin, teleprinters clattered with fragments from East Prussia. At the Bendlerblock, hesitation hardened into policy, and the window narrowed as the next phase approached. Inside the Bendlerblock, the coup began to fray under its own constraints. At Army headquarters in Berlin, General Friedrich Olbricht hesitated. The ambiguous signal from the Wolf's Lair, "Something terrible has happened." The Führer is alive, created paralyzing uncertainty. Without definitive proof of Hitler's death, he refused to issue Valkyrie. The plan's rigid precondition had become its greatest vulnerability. The conspirators needed absolute certainty to compel obedience from the wider army apparatus. Caution stalled the mechanism at the moment it needed momentum. Time leaked away. From early afternoon until roughly 4 p.m., key units in and around Berlin waited in their barracks for activation orders that did not come. Major Otto Ernst Remer, commander of the Berlin Guard Battalion and a committed Nazi, grew wary of unusual alerts and incomplete instructions. The delay seeded initiative. Regime loyalists began to recover, test lines, and prepare a counterstroke. Around 4 p.m., with incomplete information but rising urgency, initial Valkyrie orders started to move. When Claus von Stauffenberg reached the Bendlerblock near 4:30 p.m., he found hesitation, not action. He insisted that Hitler was dead, having seen the blast himself. His certainty pushed Olbricht and General Ludwig Beck to accelerate transmissions to the military districts, but the lag had already allowed the regime to reassert command nodes. In the propaganda ministry, Joseph Goebbels managed the response with precision. He knew the coup's power rested on belief in Hitler's death. He happened to be meeting with Armaments Minister Albert Speer when Remer's troops surrounded the building to arrest him under Valkyrie authority. Goebbels did not resist. He invited Remer in and placed a call to the Wolf's Lair. On the line, Adolf Hitler spoke directly to Remer and asked, "Do you recognize my voice?" The answer was yes. Hitler then ordered him to crush the putsch in Berlin. Authority flipped in an instant. Officers who had accepted Valkyrie as legitimate now saw it as mutiny. Remer pivoted his battalion to encircle the Bendlerblock. Inside, resolve gave way to confusion. Some supporters tried to dissociate themselves. Others argued over next steps, while phones carried contradictory orders and confirmations. Beyond Berlin, the picture was mixed. In Paris, General Karl Heinrich von Stauffenberg initially executed Valkyrie as designed, arresting SS and Gestapo officials and securing key nodes. When word of Hitler's survival reached France, those arrests were reversed and loyalists re-emerged. Similar reversals unfolded in Vienna and Prague as clarity about Hitler's fate spread through restored lines. By early evening, the momentum had turned decisively against the conspirators. The coup's brief advance collapsed under the weight of timing, communications, and Hitler's intact voice on the line. Power flowed back to the regime, and with it came a swift resolve to settle accounts. Night would bring the reckoning. Night of the Long Knives became the regime's euphemism for what followed in Berlin. Rapid arrests, improvised verdicts, and executions meant to erase a challenge within hours. SS troops loyal to Hitler entered the Bendlerblock, the army headquarters that had served as the conspiracy's nerve center. Claus von Stauffenberg, Friedrich Olbricht, and other key figures were seized. The complex, alive with orders and teleprinter traffic earlier that day, fell under the control of the very forces it had sought to displace. General Friedrich Fromm, commander of the replacement army, had wavered throughout the day. He had been aware of the plot, detained by the conspirators when he refused to commit, and then released as the tide turned. Now, seeking to protect himself and display loyalty, he convened a makeshift court-martial in his office. Its purpose was blunt: eliminate witnesses who could implicate him. He pronounced death sentences on the principal conspirators present. Shortly after midnight on July 21st, in the dim courtyard of the Bendlerblock, the sentences were executed. A makeshift firing squad assembled. Stauffenberg, Olbricht, Werner von Haeften, and Albrecht Merz von Quirnheim were led outside. Accounts report that von Haeften tried to shield Stauffenberg from the bullets. Stauffenberg's final words were clear: "Long live sacred Germany." Shots cracked, and with them ended the lives of the men who had tried to wrench the country away from catastrophe. Those deaths opened a wider purge. The failed coup gave the regime pretext for a nationwide dragnet beyond the known plotters. The Gestapo, led by Heinrich Müller, launched Operation Thunderstorm, a coordinated investigation that reached into every military district and ministry. It was not a targeted sweep. It was designed to dismantle an entire network. The numbers reveal the scale. More than 7,000 people were arrested. Nearly 5,000 were executed. The reach extended far beyond the army to diplomats, civil servants, theologians, and conservative politicians. The regime invoked Sippenhaft, kin liability, to punish families. Stauffenberg's wife and children were arrested. The children were held under assumed names, shuttled through camps and a children's home, before surviving relatives could reclaim them after the war. Innocents absorbed the penalty for a failed act they did not commit. This was terror administered through forms and files. Show trials were prepared. Defendants would be dragged before the People's Court, humiliated, and condemned in sessions designed for propaganda rather than justice. Executions followed with industrial regularity. The machine moved quickly. It also moved outward, touching commands in Paris, Vienna, and the Eastern Front, and drawing in civilians whose only link was a signature in a notebook or a conversation overheard. What began in the Bendlerblock courtyard widened into a relentless campaign that sought not only bodies, but the erasure of a movement. The next phase would expose how that campaign operated and what it did to those who were caught inside it. The vicious aftermath began as policy, not fury. The investigation into the July 20th plot was relentless. The Gestapo, under Heinrich Müller, launched a massive dragnet codenamed Operation Thunderstorm. This was not a targeted search for the known conspirators. It was a systematic campaign to eradicate the entire German resistance movement. Thousands were arrested. The regime invoked Sippenhaft, kin liability, arresting family members of the plotters. Wives, children, and distant relatives were imprisoned to crush opposition at its roots and deter any future dissent. Many key conspirators chose suicide to avoid capture and protect colleagues from torture. Henning von Tresckow, one of the plot's earliest architects, took his own life on the Eastern Front on July 21st. He left a final instruction to his adjutant. The assassination must be attempted, coûte que coûte. Even if it fails, we must take action in Berlin, for the practical purpose no longer matters. What matters now is that the German resistance movement must take the plunge before the eyes of the world and of history. His death denied interrogators the breadth of his knowledge. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was forced to commit suicide in October 1944 after his association with dissident circles became known. Those captured faced the People's Court and its presiding judge, Roland Freisler. The trials were not proceedings to determine guilt. They were humiliating spectacles designed for propaganda. Freisler, a fanatical Nazi, berated defendants, denied them a defense, and staged the hearings for the camera. The verdicts were predetermined. Death. The machinery was theatrical and lethal. The executions that followed were slow and gruesome. Many of the condemned were hanged with piano wire from meat hooks at Plötzensee prison. The process was deliberately drawn out to maximize suffering, filmed so Hitler could view the hangings. Executions came in batches over months, and the regime documented them with photographs, building a chilling archive of vengeance. The spectacle ended only when war intervened. In February 1945, Freisler was killed during an Allied bombing raid on Berlin, abruptly terminating the show trials. The purge extended far beyond the officers directly involved. The Gestapo's investigation exposed networks that spanned Europe. In Paris, General Karl Heinrich von Stauffenberg was arrested after attempting suicide. Civilians like Karl Goerdeler, the former mayor of Leipzig and designated chancellor, were captured and executed. Diplomats, clergymen, and intellectuals linked to resistance circles were engulfed by the dragnet. The network was dismantled from the Eastern Front to occupied capitals. Repression tightened everywhere. The SS deepened its control over the Wehrmacht. Hitler's distrust of his generals became absolute. In the short term, the regime's grip hardened, sold to the public as proof of providential survival. Yet it came at a cost: the loss of some of Germany's most capable administrators and officers in the final months of the war. Sippenhaft ravaged families, though survival threads endured. Nina von Stauffenberg, arrested after the coup, was eventually reunited with her children. She gave birth to another daughter in January 1945, and the family emerged from the war alive. The price of failure reached beyond the dead. An entire opposition was erased, and the war dragged on for months with catastrophic human toll. Yet even amid the purge, the meaning of the act could not be extinguished. What followed would shape how the world, and Germany, judged the men and women who chose conscience over obedience. A legacy of courage emerged slowly from a landscape of fear and defeat. In the immediate aftermath of the failed coup, the Nazi propaganda machine framed the conspirators as traitors and cowards, a small clique of aristocratic officers who had betrayed their country in its hour of greatest need. The goal was clear: strip their actions of moral legitimacy and reinforce the regime's narrative of unwavering loyalty to the Führer. After the war, with the regime's crimes exposed, the July 20th plotters underwent a profound reevaluation. The shift was gradual. A 1951 survey showed that only about 1/3 of Germans viewed the conspirators positively. By 1954, the first official memorial service signaled a turning tide. In both East and West Germany, they increasingly came to represent a different Germany, capable of moral resistance, even if consensus formed unevenly across regions and generations. Memorials marked that change. The Bendlerblock in Berlin, where Stauffenberg and others were executed, now houses the German Resistance Memorial Center. Plötzensee prison, where many conspirators were hanged, stands as a memorial to the victims of the Nazi justice system. July 20th became an official day of commemoration, with flags flown at government buildings. These sites and ceremonies are permanent reminders of courage within a system designed to extinguish it. The plot demonstrated a critical truth. Even within a totalitarian state, individuals retain the capacity for moral choice. The conspirators were not outsiders. They were staff officers, generals, and officials embedded in the machinery of power. For some, especially on the Eastern Front, complicity in criminal policies deepened the weight of their decision. Their break with the regime did not erase prior guilt. It made the turn to resistance morally complex, and for several, an act of belated conscience as well as strategy. Their ultimate failure does not negate the courage of their action. They moved forward knowing the odds were prohibitive and the penalty would likely extend to their families. They acted without any guarantee of success, driven by a conviction that the attempt itself had value. Henning von Tresckow's reasoning became their anchor. The assassination must be attempted, coûte que coûte, so the world would know that not all Germans followed Hitler. The story of July 20th is not primarily a tale of a near miss that might have shortened the war. It is a testament to the human capacity for resistance under extreme pressure and to the burden of choosing duty over obedience when the state becomes criminal. The hinge moment in the Lagerbaracke sealed outcomes, but the meaning endures. Their legacy remains a complex symbol: moral courage, compromised lives seeking redress, and the hard question of obligation in catastrophic times. It also sharpens how we read the mechanics of that day and why a carefully built plan faltered at the threshold of success. Operation Valkyrie shows how human choices intersect with vast systems. A briefcase nudged a few feet, a meeting moved to a wooden room, and a timer set by damaged hands. Small decisions with outsized consequences. The plotters built a mechanism to reclaim the state, yet it relied on a single confirmation that never came. Their legacy rests on the moral clarity to act when obedience meant complicity. If this story moved you, challenged you, or helped you see the Second World War differently, it would be an honor to have you join our growing community. Subscribing is a way to support stories that show how ordinary people make extraordinary moral choices. So if you believe these stories matter, hit that subscribe button and let us keep building this journey together. And do not forget to leave a comment. We read everyone and value your thoughts. Until next time, keep exploring history with Epic War. Keep asking questions. Keep seeking the truth